All right. Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Um, all right. So this is what I came up with for this webinar. Hopefully it's interesting. It kind of combines Flexbox, a little bit of JavaScript, but probably the main thing that we're working with is Flexbox, and that's kind of the main thing to take away, I guess, but maybe there's other things. All right, so the basic concept is that the user can choose how many rows they'd like to get. So kind of if you want it to only be like 4 rows, you can have 3, 2, and 1. So by adjusting this, we adjust how many appear on each row. The other bit of functionality is that, as you can see, the text gets cut off, and it kind of have this little kind of gradient that kind of suggests that there's more to read. And so if the user clicks that, then it appears as the main article at the top of the page. The other thing is that if they click that, it takes them to the top of the page. Okay. So that's kind of an overview of what we're going to be building. So to get started with, we'll have a section. And inside that section, we'll have a header. And we'll have our heading. Let's say it's an H2, say the news. And then we have a label. And the label is rows. I don't know if maybe there's better copy to use there. And then we have an input. And I'll have an ID of, let's call it row range. Then we just connect that label to that. So we know that this text is related to that. So now we have our slider. It's not doing anything yet, but it's there. The next thing we can do is we'll just add in the divs. I'm just going to copy them because I don't think anyone needs to watch me copy or write out a whole bunch of divs. Right, so there's a list of articles. It's just a div with a H3 and a paragraph. Guess I could use the article tag here, and maybe that might be more semantic. I didn't do that, so but yeah, you could probably say that I should probably use article tag, seeing as it's news. Is it easy to replace? I don't know how to replace easily in CodePen. Let's be a little bit more semantically correct, right? And it changes the closing tag, so that's nice for us. Nearly done. Oh. Just save this. Sorry about the boring copy pasting, but we may as well get it right. Okay, so there we have our articles, and they're inside of this section. Great. I did add, let me quickly grab it. So here's a link to a Google style sheet so that we don't have everything as Times New Roman. So that's now added to the head. So in CodePen, you just need to put it in stuff for head. There's a section for you. And then I'll just set the body to have a font family of Nautica text. What's the main advantage of changing div to article? It's mostly just one of semantics. So seeing as these are meant to be articles, and an article is used for editorial content. So an article as you would have on a newspaper or a magazine site or a blog, those individual pieces of content should be called and used as an article tag. You can have the one article on an article page. So if this was, say, if this was only the title was a good thing has happened, and this was the article text, and that was an individual page, you just have one article tag on there. But because here we've got kind of a list of articles, then I think the article tag is best there. It's just about using the most semantically correct option. Div is kind of the last option available. So if there's no better HTML5 element, then go with a div. And it's if you're mostly doing it for not a content reason, although you should write your HTML for content, then you can use a div. But ideally, you'll be using things like section and main and article, as I've had to use here now. So hopefully that answers that. Probably some advantage for SEO purposes. I couldn't tell you for sure, but I would guess that Google would prefer the more correct tags to be used. So they probably score that in some way. And they like good semantics and neat HTML. And yeah, so I think they would probably like it as well. And then for my headings, I've got called Della Gothic 1. There's my colors. Then the next thing I'll want to do is that on this section, I just need to add a class and have this be class of news. I'll set that to display flex, and it looks a bit tight. What we can do is we can add flex wrap. So if there's not available space, then drop it down. Also want to just place it in the middle. So you don't want a user reading from one side of the page across to the other side. So think about the journey of how far the user's eyes need to travel. And so centering the content in the middle of the page is very useful. So again, here you can see I've placed it, it's now on the left. But as a user, the main place that I'm working is here in the middle of the page. So that's just something to bear in mind. So that's why we center it there using margin 0 auto. Okay, and the next thing I'd like to do is I just want to set these news items. Sorry, it's underscores. And there, I'm just going to set to have flex 1. So I'll show you what flex 1 looks like. That's what flex 1 looks like. Takes up the available space. But I'd actually like to just set a minimum width on that. And so I can do that by setting 200 pixels. So it should be at least 200 pixels wide. And then I want to set the header to be on its own row. I don't want it forming part of the flexed child items in a row like this. And to do that, I can say that the header inside of news should be set to flex 0, 0, 100%. And as you can see, it's now placed that on its own row. So it's taking up a minimum of 100%. So just like we had here with the set taking up 200, it's now taking up a minimum space of 100%. All right, let's add a gap. As you can see, these are all pretty close together. So I just want to add a gap into my news here. So I can add gap of 20 pixels. And inside of the news item here, I'm just going to add some padding as well. So to add 20 pixels of padding there. I'd like to add a border of 2px solid black. So now our page is starting to take a little bit of shape, which is good. And I think that's enough for now. We'll come back to working on that. But what I would like to do is I'd like to set, so I'd like I would like to style. So there's this class here, news item large. And I'd like to set that to have a background. Let me grab the color. And let's set the color to white. And I would like it to appear above everything else inside of my flex container. To do that, I can set order -1. And what that does is that moves it right to the front of everything else on the page. So it's moved it out of the current order of how things go, and it's moved it to the front. Hope that makes sense. If I had to apply this class to a different element, let's say an important thing has happened. It takes it out of where it had appeared, which was at point number 4, and it moves it out to the front of the order and displays at the top. I'm just going to go back to having it there. So the first item with that class then gets moved out there. All right. Now let's work on cutting these articles off here and placing that kind of white gradient over the bottom. So to do that, we can use, what we're going to do is we're going to use line height on the lines in the code here on the page. And we're going to say that we only want certain amount of lines, right? So the problem is if we set a height, it could cut off in the middle of a line, and we want it to cut off on a rounded line. Hopefully that makes sense. If that didn't, do let me know. But hopefully if you watch it, you'll see what I'm on about. Okay, so on the HTML tag, I'm going to create a variable for line height. And I set it to be 1.4 rem. Use that on the line height. I'll use that variable. Okay, so now it's applied that new line height. And what I can do is that on the paragraph, right? So there's a paragraph inside of this article. So I can say on this paragraph, I'm going to create a new variable called max lines. And I'm going to set the maximum number of lines to be 5. And then I can use a calculation, max height, and I can calculate using the variable. So this variable that we created up here, so the line height. So I can say okay, so what I've done is I've set it to only take the max height to be whatever the line height is. So whatever I've set this line height to be times the number of lines that I want. So if I have 5 lines, it's going to give me the space of 5 lines times by this line height that I've set here. And so then it should only give me 5 lines of text. Unfortunately, you can see it's running over. The boxes are clipping, but I need to set overflow to hidden. And there you can see I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines, and then it cuts off. Okay, hopefully everyone followed that. It's a technique I found from CSS Tricks, which I can share. But essentially, you're just taking the line height and timesing it by a number that you've chosen. So I don't even have to use a variable here. I could just write that and say 5, right? Maybe that's just easier to follow. If I wanted 3 lines of text, I'd have 3. If I wanted 1, I'd get 1. You know, however many you want, you just times it by this variable. Again, I don't even need to use a variable. I could say 1.4. But yeah, I don't need to. I already have that variable created. So that means that if I decide to change my line height to 1.8, it doesn't affect what gets displayed on the page. Okay, I thought that was a neat trick. Okay, so we have that now. Next thing we need to do is create that kind of little gradient. So let's do that. We can say that first we need to set this to have position relative. And then on the news item, I'm going to place some content before. And what would have happened if I have used M's instead of rems? In this case, it would, we can test it and see. So the choice between M and rem, as you can see, that nothing changes if I use M and rem. That's because they function effectively the same way, apart from one issue that M's have. So M's have an issue that they base the font size based on the parent element. And so what you can have is you can stack I can't remember the right term for it, but effectively, let me see if I can quickly show you. Right, so if I have a span, hello, and then I have another span inside that span, this is me. Right? So I have a span inside of another span. So, don't bother me. So now if I had to set the span to have a font size of 2M, what you'll see is that the first span gets the size of 2M, but the second span bases its size on the parent element. And so it says, okay, if the base is saying 2M, it's adding that extra 2M on. And so this is effectively 4M. Whereas rem fixes that problem and keeps them the same size. So you don't have this nesting issue, which you had with M's. So that's kind of the main reason why you might want to choose rem over M. And the reason why you might want to choose either of them, in case you're not sure, is what's really nice about M's and rem is that if you are, say, visually impaired, or for some other reason you need to have text be much bigger, you can use the browser can change the size of the font for you, but it can't do that with pixels, but it can with M and rem. And so it means that if you scale up the base font size in the browser, it then just adjusts so that your headings stay as big in proportion to all the other text on the page. Hope that's helped. I'm loving the questions, so do keep them coming. That's great. All right, so the next thing is dealing with this, putting a kind of a white gradient on here. And so because I've got the set to position relative, I can absolutely place a gradient at the bottom. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set it to have a width of 90%. I can show you what happens. I can show you quickly if we have background of red. Right. And I can have a height of. Is it best practice to use rems? I would say that it's a good practice. You might have reasons to not. So what I would suggest is that you use generally pixels for placing something on a page, and spacing and padding. Maybe you want to use a viewport width or a viewport height for some reason, or a percentage. But I wouldn't personally, I haven't seen the reason why you would want to use M's or rem on things like padding and margin, because if you're visually impaired, it doesn't mean you want more margin if you change the font size. So yeah, I'd use M's and rem for font size, and I'd probably lean to rem for exactly that stacking reason that I just showed. So for me, I like rems. But with everything on the web, you'll find different people with different opinions. So there's no one set answer, but rems are, in my opinion, the better option. Right, so for our height, and I'm going to set it to be at the bottom. So I've just made it red just for now. So I'm going to set it 10 pixels off the bottom. And I'm going to, instead of having this red background, I'm going to change it to have a linear gradient. Fade to white. So if I didn't have that, as you could see, that's where it would be, but I'm applying that linear gradient and it kind of just gently fades off and kind of gives the user knowledge that, okay, there's something there. All right, so I can see that that's also applied to this news item large. So what I need to do is I just need to say that for the news item large, that there shouldn't be a background. Okay, so I think we're getting there in terms of this page, which is nice. You can see that there is some of these lines which wrap over. So I'd like to use an ellipsis to cut off these so we don't have a case where there's two lines, a two-line heading. You can see how it kind of makes it a little bit unneat. And so to do that, I can work with the H3. Is that right? Yep, those are H3s. And I'm just going to set the H3 to have, by default, to have a width of, I'm going to make it 180 pixels. And I'm going to say that there should be no wrapping if there's white space. So that now keeps it on one line. And I'm going to say that if it overflows this width of 180 pixels, that I want it to hide the overflow. And I don't like how that's just kind of cutting. You can see it's just like the letters get cut off. So to get our ellipsis, we can use something called text overflow and set that to ellipsis. So if the text is going to be cut off, you can just add an ellipsis there. So that's great on the kind of short articles here, but I don't want that for my own, for when it's the news item large. So I'll just go here and say that for this H3, I want a width of 100%. And I want it to be a bit bigger as well. So I'm going to set it to have a font size of 2 rem. And because I've got that line height set at 1.4, it's clipping it. So I just need to add a new line height. And I'm going to set it to have a line height of 3.5 rem. Okay. I think we're largely done now inside the CSS. The next thing that we can do is we can take a look. Sure, I'll find things that need to get fixed. But hopefully we can now move on to the JavaScript. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to work with this rows range. So it's called row range there. So let me select that element. ID actually. And I want to select the news items. So I want to select all of these items here. So it's this class here that I need to get. And I need to select all of them. So it's query select all. And I also just need to change. I want to also just select the news element as well. So let's quickly do that. Okay. Now, if I go and I say that row range on change, so whenever this element changes its value, run the following function. And what I want to do is when it changes, I want it to change to the value of that it's got. I'm going to quickly show you what the value of it is. So let's do that first. And so there you can see how it's changing. But I want it to be within a specific range. So I'm going to change the width of these elements. Sorry, let me find where it is in the code. It's a bit harder when it's zoomed in. There we are. Okay, so you can see there it's 200 pixels. So I'm going to set a range that I want, and I want it to the range to start at 150. So I'm going to write here min equals 150 and max equals 500. So now if I move it around, you can see that at the top end of the scale, it's 500. At the bottom, it's 150, and it adjusts in between. Okay. So now what I can do is that I can say that I want to run a loop on the news items, asking about mobile first CSS. Yeah, so I'm not going to tackle mobile responsiveness in this tutorial on this, but yeah, you're encouraged to write mobile first CSS, in which case you would be doing this differently. In terms of I would have started with mobile, but yeah, we'll see how we go with time. I just didn't prioritize it as a thing for this to go over and make it all mobile responsive. But you could do that just as well. I mean, this largely is dependent on a desktop structure that, like, you'd probably have these all in one row, and you wouldn't have an option to be able to toggle how many you view, because it would probably just be a single column. But yeah, I can talk about that afterwards, maybe if you want to chat. But certainly, mobile first is the way to go. I just didn't prioritize it in this tutorial. So hopefully that's okay. Okay, so I need to do a loop on these news items. And I'll say that each news item should now have a style. And I'm going to adjust the flex property. And I'm going to set it to 1. And then okay, so now if I adjust this, it doesn't work. Great. Why doesn't it work? Thanks. Okay, so the issue there was that the name is news items and the for each wasn't running. Cheers. So now if I go up to the top, it now displays and adjusts the size. So I think that's pretty neat. So there it's at 150 and just keeps adjusting based on whatever the user selects. So hopefully you're seeing how Flexbox allows us, we can change the values of these flexed items and how that then changes what gets displayed on the page. I'll point out so those are flex basis and flex shrink. So the question is about flex 0, 0, 100% and flex 1, 200 pixels. So flex is a shorthand way of writing flex basis, flex shrink, and so setting 0 and 0, I'm saying that I don't want it to take up any more space, or I don't want it to shrink and I don't want it to expand. I just want it to be 100%. And then here, this is saying that I want it to take up 1 flex integer. So in this example, right, so if there's two items on a row, it should take up half of that space. I'll quickly show you an example. If I could just reload this. So if we look at the news items and I set that to 0, it only takes up that 200 pixel space that it needs to, doesn't take up any more space. So it doesn't adjust to fill out the space. But it sets this 200 pixel kind of min width. Whereas if I had to set it to flex 1, it would default to how many it reckoned it could get on the page, which would be the width of this 180 pixel heading here. So what I'm doing here when I'm setting it to flex 1, 200 pixels, is I'm saying it should be at least 200 pixels wide, but above that, it can scale it itself. So I'm setting, that's why it's flex 1. And if you remember, flex 1 says that this is 1 item, 2 items, 3 items on the page. So it's 1 plus 1 plus 1. And then it divides each one. So it goes 1 over 3, 1 over 3, 1 over 3. If I had to set, let's quickly say, okay, a bad thing has happened. I'm going to set a class of change. And so if I had to say change, to set that to flex, say 5. It's being overridden. let me just set that at the bottom. Right, it then takes that and it accepts 5 spaces. So it's now taking 5 plus 6 plus 7. So it's taking 5 of 7 space and 1 of 7 space, 1 of 7 space. Taking into account the fact that it's already 200 pixels, it starts getting a little bit hard to follow. But hopefully I got across the main point there about Flex 1 adjusting to fill the available space, and then the 200 pixels setting how much width to accept. As Dario shares the CSS tricks, that is kind of a great go-to. And I think as you work with Flexbox and Grid, oh, you shared the Grid one, but yeah, this CSS tricks, both of their guides for grids and for Flexbox are both very useful and should be looked at. Okay, so that's the one aspect of it. The second is to be able to click these and for them to change to become the main featured article. And because I've got this news items array, node list here, so this I'm selecting all these news items. I can run a loop, and I just need to add a click event to that. So test that it's working. So I'll just say as a kind of general comment for students, I quite often see students submit work that they've kind of like written everything, and I'm like, but didn't you test whether the function actually works? So kind of stop yourself and just check, okay, if I click it, it does run. Just to help you catch things like that typo on the news items, for example. So the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to find the element with the, let me just remove this change class here. I want to find the element with news item large class, and I want to remove that class. So I'm going to say document.query selector dot class list dot remove, and the class I'd like to remove is news item large. Right, so if I click something, it removes that class, and you can see I get that coming through on the page. It's giving me an error there because there's now no element with news item large as its class. So I need to add that to the element that got clicked. And what I can do is I can say event, and I'll show you something, and then I'll show you a different way of doing it. If I go event.classlist.add, and I want to add the news item large class to the item that got clicked. So where the event happened, add that. Okay, so let's close that. And if I click a silly thing, it doesn't actually quite work how I would have expected. And the reason why that might be a problem to just select, event dot target is what I meant to write. Right, so if I click there, you can see now it's added the background to the paragraph where I clicked. And if I click the heading, it adds it there. So it's not, eventually I get that click to work. There I get it. But if I click there, it's not what I want. And the issue there is that I'm saying event.target, but what I can rather use is event.current target. And what that does is it says this element that I've added the event listener to, so the news item, so this news item, that's the target that I actually want. I don't want the heading or the paragraph. And so then that allows us now to be able to click and see them change. There is an issue though, if I click there, it's not a great user experience that I now have to scroll up to go and see it. So what we can do is that we can say, once that's run, we should scroll to the top. So I'm going to say top to 0 and left to 0. Sorry, those are meant to be commas. So now if I click, it takes me to the top. What I don't like though is that it's kind of jumpy. What I'd like is kind of like a smoother transition to taking me to the top. So I say I want the behavior to be smooth. So now you can see that it takes me nice and gently back up to the top. All right, I think that that's everything covered. So we've got it changing the size of the items so the user can choose that. I'm not sure there, Brian. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's easier to handle it inside the event because that is where the scroll to the top is happening. I could have an anchor. I could have an ID and I could be adding anchor tags to link to the top of the page, I guess. And there I could add the behavior of smooth to that. It, to my mind, is just easier to add it in there, but maybe there's other ways of doing it. The other thing I had was that, so when you click these things, it just doesn't feel like, it'd be nice if there's a transition. I didn't have a better solution to this, so you're very welcome to find a better one. I just added a transition on the background. 1 second. So that at least when you click, kind of feels like something's happening. I don't know. That seemed to make sense to me, at least. You just have some little transition that lets the user know the thing that you wanted to happen has happened. Are there any other questions? Comments? Thoughts? Yeah, the spelling is American, the same as color. Has to be the American spelling. Doesn't work if you spell it like I spell it. So I've had to learn to not write color the way that I was taught to at school. The question there about whether it would be easier to use Grid or Flexbox. So originally I had actually used Grid, and then I got a bit sidetracked with an idea. Sure, I'll get to the ellipsis now. I did create a version in using CSS grids. And so this is the one with grids. So it has slightly different functionality. I don't even know if it works because I just gave up on it. But I had this idea that you could change the size of the element based on whether you clicked it or not. But it didn't give me the functionality I wanted, or it just didn't feel like good user experience. It felt like a more interesting user experience to just take the element right out of the flow. So I was having it kind of expand and contract. The one issue that is that I didn't have a nice transition. I couldn't transition using it. And so I just didn't like that. CSS Grid and Flexbox browser support. You can use Can I Use to check on that. Most modern browsers support Grid and Flexbox now. It depends whether the website you're developing wants to carry support for older IE versions. Most have given up support. And so, yeah, most of the development that we teach now is assuming that it's going to go onto a relatively modern relatively modern browser. And so we teach things like Grid and Flexbox. They're largely accepted now. It's unlikely that your user would still be on, I don't know, IE7 or something. Even if there's support for that, I don't think there is anymore. So yeah, the CSS for the ellipsis, sure. So that is here in this code here. So what I've done is that I set a width of 180 pixels. So let me just go through this. Okay. So the first thing is that I set this width of 180 pixels originally, right? So without any styling, it'd look like that. And you can see kind of normal. So first thing I did was I cut off where I wanted to stop showing the text anymore. The next thing was that I added this white space, no wrap. And what that does is that it says, don't wrap the text down to fill up that 180 pixels. So now what's happened is that it's actually overflowing. So if I had to look in my DevTools, I can see that the H3 is supposed to only be 180 pixels, but it's overflowing that and going outside. So to stop that, I can say that I want any overflow to be hidden. So it cuts off the overflow. And then lastly, I add this, this text overflow ellipsis. And so instead of chopping the word in half, it uses an ellipsis to hide it. So that's kind of the basis of that ellipsis. One thing that might be useful to know is that you can only use ellipsis like that in a single line. You can't use it on multiple lines. So I couldn't add text overflow ellipsis to this paragraph that I'm cutting off. So I'm doing it pretty much the same thing, just with height here. So instead of a width of 180 pixels, I'm chopping it off at a height of that calculation. So the number of lines times the line height there. And so it's just having that overflow hidden. So if I had to add text overflow ellipsis there, nothing happens because the paragraph doesn't have that same ellipsis feature. The way that you could add ellipses if you wanted to would be to position it. So to how I've done this linear gradient. So you could have dots, right? So you can just see the dots there. I'll just put that right at the bottom. So if I put it at 0 pixels, remove that. Right there, you can see the dots now sticking to the bottom there. The next question, what about just sticking paragraph to the bottom? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Sorry, I missed which for the alignment of the. Sorry. Maybe it was something I said and I forgot what I've said. All right, sure thing. Pleasure. But yeah, if you could just explain quickly the alignment. Sorry, I'm just not getting. I'll show you while wait for kind of more clarification there. It's called line clamping CSS tricks. I think it was this. No, that's the multi-line truncation with pure CSS. And they show a few different ways of being able to put dots on things. And here you can see they're talking about that line height measurements, which I thought was quite smart. So instead of doing any of this, just have the paragraph wrap like that. Yeah, I mean, you could do that, and you could then just push the paragraph down. So you could say, I guess, in the news item, you could say something like display gives used Flexbox, justify content, Flex direction, column, justify content, space between. So there, that kind of pushes the heading to the top and the paragraph to the bottom. Maybe that's better. Maybe that's better for user experience because they get to read the full heading. Part of one of the reasons why I chose this was that I just wanted to show people the text overflow ellipsis. So yeah, sometimes I make a UX choice just to be able to show something. But that's also a good idea, and maybe it's better for UX. So yeah, and also yeah. Anyway, Hopefully that answered what you were suggesting. Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone. That was a nice long session. I hope you all have a good day. And I'll share the video again, and I'll share the code if you want to have a look over it and make your own improvements and changes. All right. Bye, everyone.